things like Facebook and Twitter, the way that has affected our medium landscape today, I would argue makes our media closer to what people in the 19th century experienced when they opened up a newspaper than the type of newspapers most of us on this call grew up with in the 20th century. Now, we call this the golden era of fake news, and I would define that era specifically as about 1835 to about 1900. I sort of see fake news as sort of like mold. If the conditions are right, it's going to grow. And if the conditions are wrong, it's going to have a harder time. In the 19th century and also in our present moment, we, because of new types of technology and new media, are in a moment where the media landscape is very hospitable to the spreading of falsehoods. I want to start just by quickly going over what newspapers and news media was like before 1835. First, a couple laws that were very influential. In 1791, of course, the Bill of Rights is passed, and that includes in the First Amendment to the Constitution, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press. And this is very important because unlike many other countries, unless something can be proved to be libelous, it's very difficult to prosecute someone for publishing something, even if it's demonstrably untrue. And so that's something that is, I think, one of our most precious freedoms. I think freedom of the press is essential to the functioning of democracy, but it does also open the door for anything. That's what freedom is. But then the act of legislation that I think was even more significant, that doesn't get the attention it deserves, is the Post Office Act of 1792, which is an incredible piece of legislation. It creates a national post office to deliver mail anywhere that people in the United States are living. And tucked into that act was this provision that said every printer of newspapers may send one paper to every other printer of newspapers within the United States free of postage. Now that's an incredible thing because postage was not cheap in an era of much cruder transportation, before airplanes, before highways, before railroads even. Getting a piece of mail from, say, Washington, D.C. to the newly created territory of Minnesota in 1849 was an expensive thing. And yet, if you were a newspaper publisher in 1849 St. Paul, you could send your newspaper to every single publisher in the country, and they could send theirs to you. And in fact, this was done intentionally by the framers of that law to try to promote an informed public. This was kind of a bit of Enlightenment optimism, where they felt that the more informed people are, the healthier democracy will be. And of course, newspapers would be a good way of informing the populace on issues that affected them. So they wanted newspapers to be able to send newspapers to each other so that they could reprint each other's stories. At this time, newspaper publishers are desperate for content and nobody's particularly concerned about copyright. Everybody is sharing everything from everyone else. So most small newspapers in the early 19th century, and actually for most of the century, had just a few employees. Usually had one editor, and then you had a few people who did the actual printing, compositing the type, pressing it out, that sort of thing. But in terms of controlling the content of that paper, it was all on the editor. So any original content that appeared in that newspaper, the editor themselves wrote it. And they, of course, can't write everything. So largely what they're doing, they'll write 1 or 2 articles per issue, and then they will be taking text from other newspapers. That's why it's important that free in the mail, they're receiving all these papers. They're going through them and deciding what are my readers going to want, and they're selecting these things. So in a very real sense, I think the newspapers of the 19th century are less like the newspapers of the 20th, which had full staffs of reporters to generate content of their own. And they're more like the type of website that you see growing more and more today, where they don't have any reporters. They're simply forwarding headlines of reporting that other people have done. They call these news aggregate sites. That's what the 19th century newspaper was like. And it's really this Post Office Act that enabled that. Now, what this also enables is it enables stories to go viral, as we would say today. If there is a catchy story with the right type of contact, every other paper in the country might reprint that exact same story. They might change it, this or that. People would often introduce their own alterations to other people's contents, but often they would take the whole block of type verbatim and just republish it, sometimes attributing it to another newspaper, sometimes not. But this, of course, creates an environment very conducive to fake news, because let's say you have some very dramatic, lurid, sensational story, the kind of story that is going to be of interest to just about anyone with a pulse. People are going to start printing that regardless of whether it's true. No one's fact checking anything, and these news stories could just spread like wildfire. Now, when they passed that act, newspapers actually had a pretty limited readership. Newspapers and journals in the 18th and early 19th century were mostly read by merchants and elites. And the page one would just be editorials. You'd have these long, rambly opinion pieces about issues of the day. And then page two was all advertisements. And then in the middle was the meat of it. And this is what people read these for. They read it for the business news, for the shipping rates, the exchange rates, stock market, international news clipping, commodity prices, the sort of stuff that business people would be interested in. And then the last couple pages were also advertisements. So they have a very limited readership when the Post Office Act is enabled, but that would start to change a little later on. Now, before newspapers become widely read by the masses, you did have a lot of publishing aimed at working class people, and those took the form of broadsides and handbills. Broadsides basically just means a sheet of paper, and they were often put up as posters. They would be posted in taverns, they would be posted on fences, that kind of thing. And they might have lyrics to a ballad proclaiming the news. They might have a short article. They were on every topic you could imagine. It was not just news, but it was also a way to disseminate theological or political arguments, public announcements, these sort of things. And there was a whole sort of business of reusable engravings and woodcuts that could be used for these sorts of handbills. And we have one there in the corner of my slide. That was not produced to accompany any specific story. It was just produced so that printers could use it whenever that particular image felt appropriate. So, and you see there's an empty bubble for putting in your own text. So I'll encourage you to mentally fill in that blank and imagine what is happening in that picture. Now, you also had pamphlets, and both working class people and upper class people and all points in between read these. And they, again, came in all genres: news, opinion, politics, polemics, manifestos, philosophy, theology, humor, fiction, ballads, plays, poetry, and more. And they were often reprinted either in excerpt or in full in newspapers. So there's a healthy crossover between the pamphlets that people would often sell on street corners in big cities, or they would go door to door in the country and say, hey, I'm selling a pamphlet, 1 penny, would you like to read it? Popular newspaper stories were often collected and reissued in pamphlet form. Now, I have a picture here of 2 of the most famous pamphlets ever published in the United States, or in I should say, North America. You have Common Sense by Thomas Paine, one of the influential arguments that helped lead to the American War for Independence. And then you have the Federalist Papers, published anonymously by Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and James Madison, arguing for the adoption of the new Constitution. That's what people often think of when we think of 18th century pamphlets. That's the classiest that pamphlets ever got. Much more typical would be this pamphlet, full title of which is Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe, concerning the secret meetings of Freemasons, Illuminatis, and reading societies collected from good authorities, by John Robison. This is one of the most successful published works of all time. It first came out in 1797, and it basically asserted that the Freemasons, which was a fraternal, is still a fraternal organization. It possibly has its roots in the stonemasons guilds of the Middle Ages, but by the 18th century it evolved into sort of a gentleman's club. It was where people would meet and they would do these sort of rituals, but for the most part, it was a place to meet and network and discuss. It was a social club very similar to the Elks Club or the Rotary Club or the Knights of Columbus or any of these sorts of fraternal organizations. It also anticipated things like insurance companies. You could pay your dues to be a Freemason or a member of the Illuminati, which was another similar club, and they would pay for your funeral if you died. If you were sick, there was a fund that could help pay for healthcare, that sort of thing. Mark Twain would quip that the great secret of the Freemasons is that they have no secrets. But according to John Robison, the Freemasons, the Illuminatis, and all these similar clubs are actually secretly a cabal that is running the world. And they are secretly kidnapping children all over the world and abusing them and sacrificing them because they are secretly Satanist. They are also behind the French Revolution. They are trying to topple all the governments of the world. They are trying to turn the entire world into chaos so that they, the elite, can rule in their secret Satanist pedophile rings and just create total political anarchy. And they're doing it by secretly taking control of all the governments. And you list all the notable people who were Freemasons, which includes a lot of the American founding fathers. And boy, this took off like wildfire. It was widely reprinted in newspapers, and it sort of was the original grand conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories of one form or another have been around forever, but the exact form that this conspiracy took gets echoed again and again and again. It gets echoed later in accusations against the Mormons, against the Catholic Church. It gets echoed in 1902 in a fabricated document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which claimed that there was a very similar world conspiracy. In this case, the Jewish people were promulgating this conspiracy. That becomes very influential on Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. And I can hear echoes of this stuff that was first laid in type in 1797 to the current QAnon conspiracies that are going around. It's like almost the same narrative, just with different actors again and again. And so that's why I kind of started with this, because this work, though it came out before 1835, which is kind of the beginning of the time I'll be focusing on, has this long shadow that continues to be cast down to the current day. Now, the cultural moment it came out in is very important. This is right after the French Revolution. It starts to really take off after the revolution in Haiti. A lot of people felt like the whole world is falling apart. And when you feel like that, you want an explanation. And if there's one thing that fake news and conspiracy theories satisfies, it's usually a simple explanation to a very complicated problem. Questions so far?
Nothing in the chat so far.
Okay, well that's good. I'll keep rolling. So now, the big turning point is the creation of what comes to be known as the penny press, and that happens in the mid 1830s, and that's when fake news is really set to take off, along with other types of news. And this really begins with the New York Sun. Published by a 23-year-old named Benjamin Day in 1833. It was the first successful paper to sell for just a penny. All the other newspapers at that point cost 6 cents per issue. There had been a couple newspapers that tried a price below that, and they found that they just couldn't make ends meet. And again, that's because newspapers are largely being sold towards this fairly limited audience of kind of the merchant elite. And there's just not enough of them to make publishing each issue at a penny rather than 6 cents financially doable. But Benjamin Day has this idea that he could get working class people, of which there's a lot more, reading newspapers if it was affordable to them and if it had content that would appeal to him. So he introduces the world's first reporter, defined as someone who's actually on staff and their job is to go find news for the newspapers. Before this point, you had editors, but no actual reporters. And this reporter is first sent to the criminal courts to cover criminal cases, because he figures that's just a constant source of drama. Everyone loves a good crime story, and that's the kind of thing that's going to appeal to working class readers. He is also the first newspaper editor in the United States to have street vendors. He hires newsies. He hires young boys and unemployed men and whoever he can find. The deal is you come, we forward you a certain number of papers the first day, and if you sell them and come back the next day, then you have to buy the papers, but you get paid back for every one that you sell. You buy them at a wholesale price. And for the first time in American history, you have newspapers being sold on the street. Before that, if you wanted to read a newspaper, you could either subscribe or you could walk into the offices of the newspaper and perhaps buy them there. But for the most part, newspapers were not widely available. The Sun pioneers this, and this business model soon dominates big city journalism and then eventually papers in general. Now, we have to talk about P.T. Barnum, and not the one that I have pictured here. If you've seen The Greatest Showman, I'm sorry, that's not how P.T. Barnum looked or acted or was. And P.T. Barnum is a man who appreciated a good lie or a humbug. I think would appreciate that movie because there's almost no factual accuracy in it. Here's P.T. Barnum. He is in New York at this same time, the 1830s. And I want to talk about him because I think in some ways he is the father of modern media in ways we don't commonly recognize him. We remember him for his circuses and his sideshows, but he was involved in newspapers as well. In fact, before he ever founded a show, his first business venture in 1829, after failing to own a general store and failing as a real estate speculator, he founds and edits a penny newspaper that was called the Herald of Freedom in Danbury, Connecticut. It's one of those papers that was not successful, and part of why it wasn't is his paper was shut down by the courts after 2 years following a series of libel suits because he made up pretty much everything that went into this paper, often very luridly attacking prominent public figures, which is why he had to flee. So he fled to New York City to avoid both legal ramifications and creditors. And this is where he gets his start in show business. There is an enslaved woman who is for sale. At this point, technically New York City has abolished slavery, but in practice, it's still alive and thriving in parts of the city. There is an enslaved woman who is claiming to be 161 years old and to have been owned by the family of George Washington. Her name was JOICE HETH. Barnum purchases this woman for $1,000 in 1835 and then sets up an exhibit. He rents a storefront in New York and exhibits her for 10 to 12 hours a day. And people would come and pay a penny to see the woman who was the nurse of George Washington, allegedly. Here we see a poster advertising that. And she would tell stories about the young Washington. She would sing songs that apparently she used to sing to young George Washington. And she had come up with this story on her own, apparently. But what Barnum does that would have ramifications on down to the present day, in my opinion, is he realized the debate over it is more important than the hoax itself. So we don't know the full story of JOICE HETH, but it seems very unlikely that her claims were true. She was, from what we can tell, probably in her 70s and had never even lived in Virginia, let alone with George Washington. But she looked very old, and for an enslaved person at that time, at that age, there's not much else that would make you useful, and most old enslaved people were allowed to just sort of deteriorate, and it was a horrible and tragic thing. So she found a way to keep herself well-fed and to keep herself valuable, so good for her. But what Barnum saw was a chance to promote something. Excuse me. And his stroke of genius was to advertise, instead of taking out advertisements, he paid newspaper editors to run stories questioning her claims. He paid doctors to examine her and tell people that she can't possibly be 161 years old. And outside of this storefront where you could pay 1 penny to come see her for yourself, he had slips of paper and pencils and told visitors who had just gone through the exhibit to write whether they thought she was real or not on the board and post it for everyone to see. So if you're in New York walking down the street, you could see this board full of all these people saying, I think she's real, she did this or that, or no, I don't think she's real. And what he realized is the more people told you something's fake, the more people had to see it for themselves. Barnum is credited, perhaps apocryphally, with the quote, "There is no bad publicity," and he really demonstrated that here. He realized that if you're trying to fool someone, the best way to fool them is not to try to silence all dissent, but actually to promote dissent. Because deeply rooted in American culture, there's this stubborn, I want to find out for myself urge, and that can only benefit you. And that would be something used by fake news promulgators again and again and again. A couple quotes he has on that topic. He would constantly, throughout his career, as he introduced one humbug after another, would use newspapers to promote it by claiming that his things were false. He would write under pseudonyms saying that new mermaid being exhibited by P.T. Barnum is nothing more than a fish and a monkey taxidermied together, which was the truth. But by putting that out there as a critic, people had to go see this Fiji mermaid themselves. So the quote is, "I freely confess that what success I've had in my life may be fairly attributed more to the public press than to the nearly all other causes combined." Now, there's also a story that one time he later opened a museum full of questionable oddities, and someone asked him if the exhibit was real, and his response was, "That's just the question. People who pay their money at the door have the right to form their own opinions after they've got up the stairs." And in a nutshell, that's what he was selling. He was not selling, here's a real mermaid. He's not selling, here's a real 161-year-old woman. He was selling, here's your chance to decide if this is real or not. And I think that same psychology is at work in some of the best fake news stories. The fact that it is dubious somehow makes us want to share it, want to see it, want to read it. Now, he called what he did humbug, and he defined it very carefully as, "A humbug is not a swindler or an imposter. If, however, a man foolishly fails to give them a full equivalent for their money, they never patronize him a second time, but they very properly denounce him as a swindler, a cheat, an imposter." So the difference for him was people still had a good time. It doesn't matter if it's fake, but if people got their money's worth, that's worth it. And according to him, people will patronize a proper humbug again and again. The first time because they're fooled, then the second time because they're not sure, and the third time to try and figure out how the trick was done. Now, that brings me to 1835, the New York Sun, the first penny press, perhaps inspired by some of Barnum's humbugs, which are taking place right around the corner from the offices of the New York Sun. We have one of the first great fake news stories. Are there any questions before we move on to this?
Nothing in the chat right now.
Nothing in the chat, good. Okay, I shouldn't say good. Please ask questions if you have them, but I'll keep moving. So the New York Sun, which had been mostly printing crime stories along with the usual sort of merchant news that newspapers were known for, has this little blurb which it attributes to the Edinburgh Courant, which was a real newspaper. Now, people who'd been closely paying attention to Edinburgh might know that the Edinburgh Courant had gone out of business 2 years previously, but nonetheless, it was a real newspaper. And they print this note that the world famous astronomer, John Herschel, who had a 40-foot telescope in his observatory in South Africa, that according to them ran on the same principles as the hydro-oxygen telescope, the world's first microscope that could see down to the level of individual microorganisms. Using this telescope, he had made a startling discovery. There are, in fact, life living on the moon. Now, the series, which ran every day for 2 weeks, it began with the first discovery, which noted the plant life of the moon, including a dark red flower, precisely similar to the Papaver roeus, or rose poppy of our sublunary cornfields. And this was the first organic production of nature in a foreign world ever revealed to the eyes of men. Now, a canny reader and an educated one might have picked up on the fact that the Papaver roes is actually the Latin name for the plant from which opium is made, which might have tipped them off that their leg is perhaps being pulled, or maybe not. But people were excited by this, and the newsies on the street were proclaiming that life had been discovered on the moon. But the best was yet to come. Soon, a whole civilization was revealed. These stories would later be collected in pamphlets and reprinted again and again and again. And so all of these illustrations that I'm about to show here are from the pamphlet forms. So here's one illustration of the lunar landscape as shown through the telescope of John Herschel. Here's another one. It turns out there's human-like creatures that are half human, half bat, man-bats, as the paper calls them. And these man-bats are constantly engaging in lewd sexual activities that they could not possibly put in print. But that was certainly exciting for people to read about. And they also have no war and have a perfect society, other than perhaps their lewd sexual activities. And this started a huge debate, and other newspapers quickly picked up this story. It soon spread around the world. You had people immediately denouncing it as fake, and others coming to its defense. And you had this healthy debate happening in newspapers across the country. And not only does the Sun's readership go up, the readership of newspapers in general starts to skyrocket as a result of this moon story. Now, a few months later, it's exposed. The series had been written by Richard Adams Locke, who'd been hired 2 months earlier as editor of The Sun. And it was exposed by his rival, James Gordon Bennett, who ran a rival paper and was determined to prove to the public that this was a hoax. But James Gordon Bennett seems to be about the only person that was actually mad about this. Many people complimented Locke. Everyone thought it was a great fun, great story. Locke would later say that he wrote this because he wanted to skewer what he called theological and devotional encroachments upon the legitimate province of science. So he thought that science and religion were getting too close. There was a religious element to this whole story, talking about how, despite the fact that they lived in another world, seemingly the people there had created churches and were setting up crosses and were worshiping statues of Jesus Christ. But the significant thing here is not only did, for at least a moment, a lot of people believe this, but everyone saw how profitable this could be. By the end of 1835, the Sun's circulation was 19,360, which was more than 4 times what it had been before the Moon series began. And most 6-cent papers circulated barely over 1,000 at that time. The Times of London, the most successful newspaper in the world up to that point, had a circulation of less than 17,000, and that's in a city 6 times larger than New York. Now, between 1830 and 1840, the US population would grow by 1/3, but the overall number of newspapers more than doubled, and overall circulation tripled. So it is really in the 1830s that newspapers in general as a medium take off, and this moon story, this very, very fake news, is front and center into helping make that happen. Now, this time period in history books, they label it as the age of Jacksonian democracy. It's an age when property qualifications for voting are being lifted in state after state. There's this sort of upsurge of populist politics where instead of just a handful of elite people ruling things, you have the expansion to every white male being involved in politics. It's a time where there's this in the culture, this very democratic spirit, this spirit of egalitarianism and populism that's starting to spread from what was formerly a much more hierarchical society. Well, part and parcel of that is, if we're all able to make decisions and vote for ourselves, or at least the white men are, if people are created equal and don't have to doff their hat to their betters as they walk down the streets, well, that means everyone's entitled to decide for themselves what's true and what isn't. And in some ways, Americans, I think, would internalize this as a fundamental right. A fundamental part of freedom is being able to, I don't need to take the word of experts. I am the expert. I decide what's true and what's right. And so the same time period of this democratizing impulse is also the most fertile time for conspiracy theories that has ever existed in this country. And all these conspiracy theories take their same basic shape from that Proofs of a Conspiracy by John Robison from 1787. So you have renewed interest in the Masons, and in fact, you have a major political party, the Anti-Masonic Party, is formed. You see in newspaper after newspaper after newspaper the same type of stories published again and again concerning Freemasons and Illuminati, but also now Roman Catholics who are behind a great evil satanic conspiracy of child abductors. You have the same things being said about Mormons. You have, especially throughout the South, constant talk of abolitionist conspiracies and rebellious slaves. Group after group are libeled with the same sort of fake stories, with the same narrative, basically, again and again, just different actors. And these have real consequences. For example, in Boston in 1830, a newspaper published a false story of a Protestant, a Catholic convent that was secretly abducting children into a child sex ring that was happening in the basement. And a few years later, in 1834, there was a riot and this convent was burned down. Now, there wasn't a basement to this convent. And in fact, there was no child sex ring or anything like that. But the newspapers had claimed it and the people believed it, and it led to the burning of this convent. There was also a woman named Rebecca Teresa Reed who published a memoir about being kidnapped and surviving sexual slavery among the priests and nuns. She earned over $3,000, roughly $77,000 today, from publishing this completely false memoir, and it helped kick off anti-Catholic riots across the country. You have riots in Philadelphia in 1844 after a fake news story. About 100 people were injured and perhaps a dozen or more people killed in those riots. This sort of thing is happening all over, and there's some notable figures, not just fringe people, who are promulgating this. Samuel F.B. Morse, inventor of the telegraph, inventor of Morse code, a man whose invention would help the spread of news more than any other invention of the 19th century, real or fake. He was also a hardcore conspiracy theorist. He published booklet after booklet talking about the conspiracies that Catholics were secretly trying to take over the United States and impose what he called Vatican law on citizens of the United States, that Catholics were depicted as irredeemably foreign, under mind control more or less of the Pope, and of course committed to all sorts of nefarious things. And Morse was convinced of this, and as he was selling his telegraph patent to various news outlets, he would often offer a deal where he would say, you can be hooked up to a telegraph for free if your newspaper publishes some of my tracts on the Catholic conspiracies. And newspapers did it. So yeah, this is very mainstream. Mormons are also, a new religious sect that has emerged and subject to all manner of conspiracies. This is an image from an 1838 riot in which citizens of Missouri basically tried to run every Mormon out of town violently, a riot that had started off of false newspaper stories about atrocities being committed by the local Mormon community. Now, none of that compares to the excitement that would get going if there were rumors of a slave rebellion or of an abolitionist conspiracy. And perhaps the granddaddy of them all is what they came to call the Murell Excitement. So in 1835, a pamphlet was published called A History of John Murell, the Great Western Land Pirate. And it claimed that John Murell was a criminal who was seeking to unite every criminal in the Mississippi Valley. And all these criminals were going to secretly liberate all of the enslaved people and have them murder every single white citizen who was not a part of Murrell's, quote, mystic clan, which was the name of his organization. They were going to murder all white citizens on July 4th of 1835 and liberate the slaves. And it details all of his crimes leading up to this. And the thing was, there was a guy named John Murell. At that time, he was a small-time bandit serving time in Tennessee prison for quote-unquote slave stealing. He'd actually been kind of a small-time con man criminal. What his MO was, he would go to plantations and convince some enslaved people that he would help them get to freedom. He would pose basically as someone working for the Underground Railroad. So he would help enslaved people leave where they'd been enslaved, and then he would go to slave markets and sell them. So that was his deal. He was basically quite literally stealing chattel property under the law of that time. But today we would look at it and say that he's basically promising freedom to an enslaved person and instead turning around and selling them. So that's what he had been arrested for. But somehow, for reasons we still don't really understand, he gets picked up by this pamphlet and people just go nuts. To this day, we use things like the Salem witch trials as this perennial example of hysteria. I think we should be talking about the Murell Excitement as just the pinnacle of hysteria, because across the South, not only is this printed in newspapers, but you have slave owners start torturing their slaves to try to get information on this plot. And when people are tortured, the thing is, they will start confessing whether there's anything to confess about. And so you have all these conflicting confessions that come from enslaved people at the force of torture. And that just leads to more people. And so you have across the South, various people being lynched for apparently being part of this conspiracy. In Vicksburg, they round up everyone who had ever visited a gambling den, because Murell was trying to unite the criminals, and gambling was technically illegal, though very popular in Vicksburg. So they round up all the gamblers and lynch them en masse. Anywhere from 8 to 20 people were lynched, depending on the accounts. And this is happening in places across the South, throughout the Mississippi River Valley. It's very hard to get an accurate number of what happened, because none of these newspapers are necessarily accurate. None of the sources we have are reliable, but anywhere from 100 to 500 people were killed in the hysteria that resulted from this pamphlet that was later revealed by its author to be a complete falsehood. Now, even though it was debunked at the time and historians have prodded into it and found there to be no substance behind these allegations, it still gets repeated to this day. Here's a historical marker that talks about the Mystic Clan, and it's repeated in history book after history book as fact, especially older books that were published in the South. It's illustrative of how fake news can become fake history. In fact, even right now, if you look up the Wikipedia article for John Murell, it talks about the Mystic Clan as if it was a real thing. And if you look into the citations, it's citing these 19th century sources that were themselves very dubious. So just because there's a footnote doesn't mean something's true. Yeah. Any questions yet, Sophie?
Quiet chat today. I think we're all enthralled.
Okay. Now, sadly, this panic was nothing compared to the hysteria that spread across the news in across the South, that the most sinister, radical, arch abolitionist conspirator of them all had just been elected president. I'm being tongue-in-cheek there, but if you were to read Southern newspapers, you would believe that Abraham Lincoln was, in fact, not just opposed to the spread of slavery, as he had stated many times on the campaign trail, but was, in fact, plotting the bloody overthrow of all people who would hold people enslaved, and that he was, in fact, this radical abolitionist that was there to abolish slavery. And those false rumors would help lead to secession, which sparked civil war. Now, in the North, there were plenty of rumors, too. The New York World published an article in 1864 during the re-election year called Miscegenation, the theory of the blending of the races applied to the American white man and Negro. And if you took it at face value, it appeared to be a pamphlet advocating white people intermarrying with black people, and that this was something everybody should do, and that we should hold miscegenation balls to try to mingle the races. Now, it was written by someone who was themselves very racist and wanted to tar and feather the Republican Party as being the type of people that would advocate this. And the world alleged that these quote unquote miscegenation balls were happening across the country. In fact, they wrote, "This fact we certify, that on the floor during the progress of the ball were many of the accredited leaders of the Black Republican Party, thus testifying their faith by their work in the hall and headquarters of their political gathering. There were Republican office holders and prominent men of various degrees, and at least one presidential elector on the Republican ticket." Now, none of this was true, of course, but it appalled many white readers, and they were appalled by images such as this one that accompanied the articles. This is, of course, after the Emancipation Proclamation. This is when the future of the millions of enslaved people in the United States was very much up in the air. And the sort of racist backlash to the Emancipation Proclamation and how it changed the nature of the Civil War was being embraced by these northern newspapers who did not want Lincoln to be reelected. And indeed, they probably did hurt his chances. He lost New York largely because of newspaper accounts like this. Now, turning closer to home, here in Minnesota, we had our own fake news. Minnesota in the mid-19th century was still what you would consider a sort of frontier territory or state. And frontier newspapers were a little bit different than the big city newspapers like the Sun. They served three primary purposes. One was boosterism, sending rose-colored news of the territory to Eastern papers. The next was promoting party politics. And last but not least, keeping Western residents informed of Eastern news. But that first one, boosterism, was arguably the most important. They're sending their newspapers out east, and they are trying to get their territory, in our case, Minnesota, settled. So they're writing about how great Minnesota is, knowing that if someone was thinking of moving here, the first thing they're going to do is look up a Minnesota newspaper and see what the news is like. Now, one of the first newspaper in Minnesota was the St. Paul Pioneer, and they wrote, "The frontier press is more influential indirectly than directly, by being copied and multiplied in the enormous city papers which penetrate every corner of the world." Here in Minneapolis, or what was then St. Anthony, the Northwestern Democrat wrote, "We must blow our own trumpet if we would have our territory and our village known and the country about us settled." And that could lead to some pretty dubious statements. For example, James Goodhue, editor of the Pioneer, was actually called out by some of St. Paul's residents after he wrote that Minnesota's winters were exceedingly pleasant, among the mildest in the nation. So he walked back his claims slightly. He wrote, "In fact, he basically says, what I meant to say is, we have no wind, so that we actually suffer less in the coldest weather than they do at a much milder temperature. Where there is no wind, the body soon generates and carries along with it a warm atmosphere. Our cold weather is dry, bracing, exhilarating. It gives us appetite and makes us fat." So, you guys who live in Minnesota, I'll let you decide whether that's true or not, but that's his claim. Now, while the Western newspapers are trying to make their states and territories sound like paradises on earth, the Eastern newspapers were happy to reprint every slight rumor about quote unquote Indian massacres that came off. And in fact, you read the New York papers and it sounds like the entire West is just awash in blood, as there's just constant conflict. They would frequently make up Indian massacres. But when there was actual conflict between Native Americans and European American settlers, it too would not only get reported, but would get magnified. So in 1857, there's what came to be known at the time as the Spirit Lake Massacre. There was a conflict between some members of a Dakota band and some of the settlers near Spirit Lake, Iowa, and eventually 39 people were killed in that. And those 39 gets blown out in the Eastern papers to thousands and thousands of people getting killed by the Indians in Minnesota. Some of these Eastern papers reach Minnesota, and people are reading them and saying, wait a minute, They're reporting things like Minneapolis and St. Paul have been burned to the ground. This prompted a letter from a pioneer settler, Edwin Washburn, to his father, who lived out east. He wrote in April of 1857, "I should not be much surprised if you've seen accounts something like this in the papers. The Indian War, terrible slaughter. All the settlers on the Watauga and Blue Earth rivers have been murdered and scalped. The Indians in force of 1,000 strong are burning the houses and marching upon Mankato. Later news, we've just learned from authentic sources that every settler in Minnesota Territory except one has been killed. And he escaped with so great a difficulty that the Indian bullets tore off his clothes and left him entirely naked." So that's satire, but actually pretty close to the actual types of things that are being printed. Now, one notable stand the St. Paul Pioneer did take, they claimed that they refused to publish quack medicine advertisements and articles, which was another staple of 19th century newspapers. They wrote, "The press is abominably prostituted to the use and profit of quack medicine vendors. Publishers ought to refuse to advertise many of the infernal nostrums and are extensively advertised, whatever price may be offered. It's our determination to advertise no remedy which we ourselves would refrain from taking." Then, when they were paid for advertising a booklet on phrenology, which they considered dubious science, because it was, they wrote, alongside the ad, "We publish today the advertisement of Fowler and Wells, because it is sent to us to publish. But we assure our readers that in our opinion, a more arrant humbug was never hatched than this same phrenology. We never saw yet a discipline of Fowler who was not an empty, conceited fool." And yet they still published the ad, and in fact published it week after week after week with this same disclaimer next to it. So it seems neither Fowler nor Wells really minded. Perhaps it's that Barnum principle. Now, other papers that weren't so ethical are publishing all sorts of advertisements for things. There's no standardized sort of medical school yet in the United States. There's no medical boards that you have to get certified by. Anyone can declare themselves a doctor. There's no FDA to oversee food and drug claims. And so there's just all sorts of quack stuff being sold, including the infamous Charles Stanley's snake oil liniment, which was just oil. It was supposed to cure everything, but it didn't. One of the grossest, there's the Kickapoo Indian Worm Killer, which was a pill that you would swallow and it would cure just about everything, including getting rid of worms. Now, in truth, the makers of this would actually take live worms, wrap them up in a little gelatin coating, and sell them. And so you'd be swallowing actual worms. And what would happen is eventually those worms would come out of you and you would perhaps observe them in your stool and you would think, oh my goodness, the Kickapoo Indian Worm Killer worked. In fact, it was giving you the thing that it was curing you from. Another notable figure, William Rockefeller Sr., who was a con man, he made quite a lot of money selling what he called rock oil, which was petroleum. He bought up a little oil well in Western Pennsylvania, and selling rock oil as a cure-all made him fairly wealthy, enough to give a loan to his son, John D. Rockefeller, who transformed that oil well and that starting capital into becoming the world's wealthiest man. So one of the great American fortunes is built on the shoulders of quack medicine. Now, there was at this time, one of the greatest public health threats was smallpox. Smallpox claimed more than 400,000 lives every year on average during the 19th century. And smallpox was one of the only things that we actually had a vaccination for. The smallpox vaccination was invented in the late 1790s. Since 1819, the US Army had been using it successfully. But everywhere that you had cities starting to mandate vaccination, which was happening at city, county, and state levels throughout the country, there was a movement against it. And it was largely working class people who were opposed to vaccinations. They were often tied to conspiracy theories that it was the Masons, or it was the Mormons, or it was whoever the boogeyman of the moment is trying to vaccinate to do away with Irish people, or to do away with working class people, or whoever. It remained fairly fringe until a woman from Minneapolis named Laura Little got on the stage. Um, her son died of diphtheria in 1896 after months of recurring ear infections. Now, this is a time when there was a diphtheria epidemic raging through Minneapolis at the time. But for whatever reason, Little was convinced that her son had not actually died of diphtheria, that in fact it was the smallpox inoculation he'd received the previous year that had made him sick. She noted that he got an ear infection right after the inoculation, and he would continue to get ear infections and then later diphtheria. And she was convinced this was all caused by the vaccine. And so from her Minneapolis home, she starts publishing a magazine called The Liberator. She resurrects the masthead from the old magazine that was William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper and turns it into an anti-vaccine magazine that is also advocating what she called mind cure, which was a very popular movement that basically said positive thinking can cure anything. This is also the time when things like Christian Science are taking off. There's really, for the first time in American history, there's something like a medical consensus emerging. There are schools that are respectable, that are teaching and giving degrees to doctors. There are peer-reviewed medical journals for the first time. There's starting to be a mainstream medicine for the first time. And you see people like Little forming the counter to that, which is the alternative medicine movement. And at the center of it was her opposition to vaccines. And in publishing The Liberator, which quickly has a popular global readership, she publishes interviews with doctors that didn't exist. She publishes statistics that she made up. Her Liberator is not just claiming vaccines are deadly, but is using fake statistic after fake statistic to claim it. She eventually gets arrested in 1916 under the Espionage Act because she had been touring army camps in Europe and telling them not to get vaccinated. So that's the kind of thing that will get you arrested. She's in jail for a year and released. Until her death in 1931, she maintains that vaccines had killed her son. Now, nonetheless, vaccines still are pretty popular because at this time, most people are still very aware of the danger of things like smallpox and measles. These are very deadly diseases that are very prevalent. And most people, even if they acknowledge that there might be some risk to taking a vaccine, which is not necessarily proven in Little's case, but even if there were risks, they can see the risks to not taking a vaccine all around them. So her movement remains fairly fringe until the 1950s. And that's when there's a polio epidemic. There's a vaccine that is rushed into production by the Eisenhower administration. 6 batches are made, and one of those batches is contaminated and sent out before it's properly tested. Now, the vaccine itself was not a problem, but it was what they mixed it with was some contaminated things. And thousands of kids die from that vaccine in the 1950s. And the modern anti-vaccination movement is kind of born from that moment. Well, when people were starting to campaign against vaccinations in the 1950s and again in the 1980s and onto today, many of them started doing research into things like old copies of The Liberator. And so these fake statistics, these fake things that were invented by her at the turn of the century have this new life, and some of them are continuing to be spread to this day. So that's Minneapolis's dubious contribution to the world of fake news. Now, this also, I'm going to wrap up a bit here. The golden era of fake news, I've just highlighted a few sort of representative examples, but these are the types of things that were just spreading. If you opened any newspaper in the 19th century, there's probably at least one somewhat dubious article somewhere in it. But where that starts to change, you have, first of all, the rise of what they called stunt journalism, but we would call it investigative journalism. So stunt journalism meant someone actually doing research. This is when newspapers, the big ones in cities like New York, are starting to hire reporters, not just to go to the courtroom and report on criminal cases, but to do actual research. And if you're trying to sell papers by doing that, it helps if people can actually trust you. So trustworthiness starts to become a commercial advantage as this type of journalism becomes more popular. You also have the beginnings of journalistic codes of ethics being created by journalists, by newspapers. You have journalism as a potential major at colleges and universities emerging as one of the many social sciences that are emerging. This is a cartoon of the very corrupt politician Boss Tweed in New York. A series of newspaper articles would be Boss Tweed's undoing. And it not only helped change the corrupt politics of New York City, but it helped legitimize newspapers in the eyes of many. And the more newspapers criticized Boss Tweed, the more sales they made. So it made a commercial incentive to start doing investigative journalism. Joseph Pulitzer would play a big role in it. Now, he, in his early days, he took over the New York World in 1883. He printed as much fake news as anyone. So he doesn't quite have a leg to stand on for consistency. But later on, he would claim that what a newspaper needs in its news is terseness, humor, descriptive power, satire, originality, good literary style, clever condensation, and accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. And he would have signs on the walls of the offices of the New York World that just said accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. He began to really stress to his employees and to his readers that accuracy is what mattered. Now, he would publish a lot of very fake news in the lead up to the Spanish-American War, as would his rival, William Randolph Hearst. But I put this, which happened in about 1898, a bunch of fake news stories that were claiming, for example, that Assistant Secretary to the Navy Theodore Roosevelt was convinced the explosion of the Maine, a warship that blew up in a harbor in Cuba, he was convinced that it was not an accident. Well, Roosevelt never said those words. The interview was a fake, but hundreds of papers published that. They published, this is an account of Spaniards searching women on American steamers, a sort of lurid drawing for the time of the naked woman. This kind of thing never happened. It was made up by the newspaper editors. There were a lot of demonstrably false stories being printed in the lead up to the Spanish-American War, and it helped win over public enthusiasm and enthusiasm in Congress for joining that war. But I put that as the tail end of the golden era of fake news, because after that, there was a huge backlash. There was a congressional committee set up to investigate false reporting in the lead up to the Spanish-American War. There were tell-all memoirs published by journalists who worked for Hearst's and Pulitzer's papers that exposed how they made up stories. They exposed how they told lies, and in some cases probably added some lies of their own. For example, there's the famous story that illustrator Frederick Remington was sent to Cuba to see the atrocities being committed, to see the war against the Cuban rebels and their Spanish colonizers. And he telegraphed back, "There is no war." And Hearst is reported to have telegraphed, "You supply the pictures, I'll furnish the war." Now that comes from one of these journalistic memoirs published in 1901. And most people who have looked into it agree that exact exchange probably never happened, though it is fairly indicative of the attitude that Hearst took towards his papers. So there's this backlash, but the other thing that's happening is it's the era of consolidation. You have oil companies buying up smaller oil companies, railroads buying up other railroads, and the same thing is happening in the world of newspapers. There's no longer hundreds of independent newspapers. You have people like Hearst, like Pulitzer, who are owning hundreds of papers across the country. You have huge newspaper syndicates. And when you have something like that, they start to steer their coverage towards the middle. They have biases, to be sure, but publishing outright falsehoods or anything that's too partisan one way or the other starts to sell less papers if you're targeting the widest possible audience. And so as we enter the 20th century, you start to have a professionalizing journalism. You start to have newspapers with ethical codes of conduct for their reporters. You start to have newspapers growing large staffs of reporters doing actual work instead of just republishing stuff that comes from other papers. And you have an economic incentive not to rock the boat too much. And so if newspapers of the 20th century come to have a bias, it's a bias towards centrism. It's a bias towards coverage that will not be too offensive either to the right or to the left. And that's perhaps a dangerous bias in its own ways at times, but it does avoid some of the extremes which we saw in the hyper-partisan 19th century press. And so this continues to grow and evolve, but in closing, I would just argue that this sort of fairly trustworthy, generally accurate, consensus type of news reporting that emerges at the turn of the 20th century is what many of us grew up with. And I think that type of reporting is perhaps in danger of going away, because I think the internet largely has created conditions that are very similar to the emergence of the penny press in the 1830s. And as evidence, I would simply point out we're seeing some of the same types of news stories. As I was reading these old newspapers, I kept being struck by time and time again how if you just replace a few words here or there, some of these news stories that were false then could be published right now and would immediately go viral across the internet if the right people were involved. So it is what it is. It's perhaps the inevitable consequence of a free press, which I do think is essential for democracy, but it can be a double-edged sword. Freedom means the freedom to do reprehensible things as well, and that is true with freedom of speech. So yeah, if there's one little bit of closing advice I would give, it's actually familiarize yourself with fake news. There's different ways to do this. Snopes.com is an excellent resource for looking up what types of false claims are out there. And the reason I say that is sometimes if you spot one piece of fake news, you'll start to develop a kind of sixth sense about how to spot it elsewhere. You'll start to see the types of narratives that are appealing, the types of things that spread, the types of stories that are prone to go viral, whether they're true or not. They're stories that appeal to the emotions rather than reason. They're stories that confirm what we already believe. As you're reading news and wondering, is this true or not? The stories you should be most skeptical of are the ones that confirm what you yourself believe. And I think that's as true as now as it was in the 19th century. And the last thing I'd say is just study history, because history never repeats, but it does rhyme. And there's a lot of rhymes happening right now.